Hello there, nice to see you again. My name is Patrick, I'm a biochemist, and to make my own lab more sustainable, I had to work through the topic of procurement as well. This is why in the following we will see what sustainable procurement actually is, but we will also see some applied examples of how you can find green items for your own laboratory. And so without further ado, let's jump right in. I will take you through how I made sense of this topic because I think sustainable procurement is something that is sometimes rather complicated and certainly nuanced and delicate in various senses. And because there's no regulations coming, this might be an important topic, not only to make your lab more sustainable, but also to comply with what you might need to do in the future. Certifications are numerous. I think we all know this, whether we go to the supermarket and buy some groceries or whether we try to find new materials for the laboratories. There are much too many of these certifications to know all of them and understand all of them. However, in this kind of maze, there are some, let's say, hidden secrets and discoveries to be made. The first one is that all of them have a different focus. That means there are so many of these certifications because we can use them for various reasons. And I think this will become a key later on because secondly, no, they're not all easy to understand. They are different in many ways, not just on the things they focus on, that what they want to give a certification for, but also in terms of when you have to renew them and actually how they are, so to say, verifying what they are certifying. And finally, which are relevant is sometimes unclear. I know this sounds very harsh, but it is the truth. Some of them are very difficult to understand in the sense that which one should you look for? If a product has one but not the other, which one should you prefer? And we will try to bring some more clearness into all of this. Because if you still have no clue what procurement is purchasing focused. That means the items and services you buy for your company and laboratory. This is basically it. Procurement is an important topic. There was an interesting study by Pieper et al. It is now a preprint that showed that about 56% of laboratory emissions can be due to purchasing. That means they used some data from labs in France and showed that, again, the biggest amount from carbon dioxide emissions came from just the purchasing and the delivery of items. And this is because of so-called scope 3 emissions. For those who are not familiar with the scope terminology, there are scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1, the emissions that you directly produce. Scope 2, those, for example, that are related to the energy and the water that you need. And scope 3, that are things that, especially in our context today, are related to supply chains. That means when you deliver us, your suppliers bring something to you, they will cause a footprint, and this is a scope 3 emission. And there were some studies suggesting that you can reduce the emissions by about 75% when you switch from these container ships to railroad. That means trains in the end. And of course, there's a huge opportunity. Cost savings for Unilever in 2020 were 1.2 billion in working procedures. That means not just those, but also, for example, PepsiCo and Nike, if I remember correctly, save $50 to $60 million just by optimizing their procurement. So there's a lot of possibility. There's a lot of potential there. And this is why it worked in my head. And I was like, there must be something about it. And my confusion might have been understandable, but then I tried to make sense of it by saying, okay, let's at first talk about what is sustainable procurement. Let's try to understand it. Because the sustainable there plays an important part, because if procurement and purchasing is mainly about the items you buy, how to make it more sustainable. And here I use a nice framework from Mandiri, which is a strategic procurement group. And at first is to make your procurement sustainable, it needs to be effective. That means if somebody says, oh, I should order DNA prep kits, I understand a new coffee machine, this is not effective because we assume that your research and your company is contributing to society and to create a better future in the end. Close related to sustainability terms, efficiency, right? Because if you say my product has seen every continent on Earth, basically a goal you might have as well for your vacation, this might not be very effective given that you will wait for a longer time than if you buy from somebody in close proximity, aka nearby. They also said open and competitive procurement processes are sustainable. How is this to be understood? Just because you might have a friend assembling CRISPR kits in his or her garage, that doesn't mean that if you buy from them, you really have a good procurement strategy, because you want to be open to let everybody basically compete to who has the best offer to make you in terms of price, but also in terms of sustainability with the Scope 3 emissions, for example, as we have seen. Transparency, right? If you cannot differentiate these numbers, whether they might be a phone number or your daily revenue, your processes are not really transparent. It is difficult to see basically who are you buying from, why are you buying from them, and basically what is their footprint. Your processes to be sustainable should be fair. I think this is quite intuitive. And accountability, especially when we talk about labs and companies, being accountable or taking accountability is not easy because, you know, we often think that we do not want to blame somebody because they tried hard or because we basically benefit from them. But for sustainable procurement, it is important that you make sure that you know who is accountable for what. That means who is accountable for buying these items, who is accountable for making the decisions where they are bought, and who is accountable basically in the end for which footprint. That means if you buy from a company and they basically use child labor to produce the items, whom should you keep accountable for this? These are principles that you should figure out. And the last two are number 7, responsibility. Forests burning and children working, unfortunately, is not only happening in movies. That means if you want to be responsible and therefore sustainable, this is something that you should consider, as well as independency. That means just an oracle forsaking you, which product you should buy is not quite independent. The very same is when, for example, your stakeholders tell you what to buy instead of you really looking at the market and finding out who is the best deliverer for your product, who is the one that you should actually be buying from. These 8 different principles are somehow fluffy because I think they're all given intuitive sense, but to implement them might be a bit more difficult. And this is why I want to definitely talk about why sustainable purchasing is certainly a challenge, because to make things more sustainable means that we need to consider the different aspects of sustainability. That is environmental, but it's also economical. That means how expensive an item might be, but also how societal responsible it might be. Where are you buying? Are these labor conditions proper? But of course, these are especially competing interests in the short term, because you might say, I want to have something that has a longer lifetime, but if it is more expensive in the beginning, will you be able to afford it? And this, of course, goes along with a certain risk that is associated, because if you change something, you might not know whether it goes well or not. And this is why, in the end, we all struggle with these kind of limited insights. At first, we do not know all the solutions out there. This is why, again, it is important to basically invite all the solutions. You want to be open, independent, and basically look at the market unflawed, you might say, and therefore try to extend your horizon as much as possible. However, you can't perfectly know everything. And this is why I think what we want to tackle today are 2 main aspects. The first one is trust. You need to trust somebody to say, okay, if I buy from them, I believe in them, that what they are claiming is actually true. And of course, the time to learn. That means, will you be able to know what all of these different certifications mean? Do you have the time to search for alternative products, or are you basically limited in that sense? So let's talk about trust at first. The question is, are you certain? That means you can be very happy because, yeah, for sure, if you buy from somebody nearby, the footprint's going to be low, and you can be pretty sure about that. Maybe you cannot be certain. You might not trust anybody because there are a lot of logos. We know about the carbon offsetting. That means just people buying certificates that saying we plant some trees and so you can quote unquote produce more carbon has a lot of backlashes. And of course, there are many claims people make. However, there are certain claims that you have to check up on, but you can somehow trust when you know how you check on them. And this is what we want to discuss here, because it's about certifications and regulations. And to basically share what I found most suitable to use were 4 questions. What does a certification assess? How do they assess it? When is it renewed? And potentially, although this one is more complicated, how stringent are they in handing over the certifications? To give you an example, I think from all the logos I've shown you beginning, these are 5 that are very useful for everybody who runs a company in the R&D sector or a lab or is working in a lab and buys products. And those are ones that we will again show you some more in the summary. I don't think it makes sense to go through all of them, but basically for a very short overview, EcoVadis is basically a company that certifies all kinds of companies, all industry, all sizes. ISCC doing pretty much the same for supply chains and carbon emissions. Energy Star, obviously for products, how much energy they use. The ACT labels, we will see a label for especially research-based machines and their overall footprint, and the ISO certifications as an international standard for all sorts of things. That means from energy, as well as, for example, greenhouse gases and the emissions that are related to the production of a certain product. And to give you an idea, what do they assess, right? ISCC, as I mentioned, they're all about the processes. That means, is your process more sustainable? However, ACT label and Energy Star, obviously, you will find on a certain specific product. So, for example, let's say Eppendorf has multiple machines, and some will have the ACT label or an Energy Star and some not. You might want to ask, how do they assess it? That means on-site and desktop assessment means they really have a look at what you are doing versus desktop. They look at data that you compile. And for example, the ACT label is mainly desktop focused. That means they will have a look at all the data the company provides to them. If the company makes a mistake, you can only see this if in the end the data doesn't work up. And how often is it renewed? Most of them are annually. The ISO, for example, is every 3 years. And this is also something to consider. However, I think the industry standard is mainly annually. And still you might ask about the governance, because some of them are, issued by the government. Some of them are non-governmental organizations, and some of them are private. And the ISCC, for example, this is kind of an initiative. So it's sometimes, again, also here hard to really figure out who is guiding those. Is it companies? Is there some influence? How independent are they really? Let's talk about time for learning, because these certifications can give you a sense whether you can trust a certain company that says, we have certified our product, you can trust us. Can you really do this? That depends. Also because these different certifications are sometimes as they mean we are certified, and sometimes they have different levels. For example, the ACT label, they give you a scale from 1 to 10, and 1 is the best, 10 is the worst. And so you can see, how do these things compare, right? This is what I mentioned about the stringency. Others, again, have, for example, a silver, gold, bronze level, and some of them, again, are just either got the certification or not. But to save you some time from learning all of these things, let's dive in, because at first, sometimes it is really useful before you buy a product to look at what other people have found about it. This is from a brochure that Eppendorf shared. And here it's all about cooling. That means, for example, as you see, the centrifuges, but also freezers and coolers. And I don't want to overwhelm you with all of this information. Basically, I want you to see that here is a very interesting graphic. And this one is basically the greenhouse gases, right? A carbon footprint from these different cooling agents. You have a liquid or gas that is cooling in these machines. And as you can see here, they have a different footprint. And this very long bar here is one that is, again, such a compound that is carrying some fluorines. And this is why it is so very problematic for the environment. But as you can see here, this greenhouse gases or this global warming potential is indicated. So these companies sometimes give you all the data you need. You don't need to go through all kinds of different certifications to find out sometimes they give you this information. And this is why just having a look, just again, screening through it can be very powerful. To give you another example, let's say you're Googling some tubes, right? Let's become very pragmatic here. And this is, for example, from Carl Roth, the website. And as you can see here already, there's something like Road for Future, made in Germany, all these kinds of claims. And as we've just seen, to trust these logos is often very dangerous. This is why if you scroll further down, you see something like this, a long list, and you might just say, do I need to read all of this? There's something mentioned about the ACT label, but I can't find it. Road makes it very easy. They have an additional section about sustainability telling you where this tube is coming from, saying that this is a 90% bio-based polypropylene tube. We'll come back to this later. But again, these are the things that really makes it more easy for you to get all of these informations right away. And so also if you go to Fisher Scientific, you see this little leaf here, few more claims, and you might already be a little bit disappointed because you will go to this website, you see all these different kinds of things you need to look at, but no, also Fisher Scientific makes it a little bit easier. They have an overview for you, showing you all the different companies, all the different deliverers, and whether they have, for example, here the EcoVadis rating, and whether they have science-based targets. And here you can see basically to get a little overview whether you like to buy from them or not. Nevertheless, we talk about sustainability in a laboratory, in research and development processes. This is why sharing my experiences, what can really help you to do the steps is at first, before you buy, can you set up a collaboration or lend some chemicals? This might seem very trivial, but again, the biggest reduction you can get by, again, avoiding to purchase anything in the beginning. However, if you do so, innovation is a big topic, especially for companies in the sector of the bioeconomy. Can you use waste streams? Can you use a different method? For more academic labs, you can ask yourself, for my HPLC, can I use, instead of ACN, acetonitrile, for example, ethanol as an eluent? That in some cases might even speed up your elution and experimental times. Can I use a new machine for mass spectrometry or microscopy? Right? All of these questions should go into what in the end you buy. What do you need for research? And still, is there something new on the market that maybe is not directly connected to your original research question, but might help you and reduce the impact? Don't be mindless. I think this is really much more focused on academic labs. That means consider organization distribution software. Too often it happens that we do not consider expiration dates, that some things are ordered and they end up in some cupboard. And unfortunately, the things we bought are then just left there and will never be found because somebody is taking it, somebody is putting it somewhere, and somebody is needing it. And this might not be the same person, unfortunately. The same counts for the purchasing itself. That means if you have multiple labs in the institution, ask whether you want to purchase together. Not necessarily every single item, but you could, for example, have simply an Excel sheet to have these different kinds of purchases that you're going to do, because then you can order in bulk, which indeed will sometimes enable you to save some money, but it will also assure that with these bulk orders, you'll be able to buy some things that otherwise might not be feasible for you, especially when we talk about labs with less funding that, for example, want to afford some antibodies. This can be a powerful strategy to not only reduce your footprint because all is delivered together, but also to enhance your research by enabling you more possibilities. And finally, reduce. A great example that we talked about last time is you can order only columns and you, for example, do a DNA prep instead of buying the entire kit because you can reuse the collection tubes. For the next time, for example, want to buy some tubes, we talked about this. These bio-based Eppendorf tubes, they are produced more sustainably because they are made out of all old plant oils. That means, for example, waste streams and leftovers. And this is why, again, your purchasing, your procurement will be more sustainable, will be greener, that you can then also share in your reporting just because you opt for such a product. Secondly, delivery and packaging. right? Because you cannot always change what you buy, but sometimes from whom you buy it. And here, for example, we have NEB that instead of using plastics, now tries to use paper and hemp-based product for the insulation of the materials. Also, what they enable is that sometimes nowadays primers are sent, for example, at ambient temperature instead of really cooled. Because as you know, by cooling, you need some insulation material, you need some cooling packs, or even liquid nitrogen, which again is not very sustainable at all. And finally, consider the downstream life. Here, an example from LabCon, right? If you have, instead of plastics, for example, these paper cartridges, they might be much more feasible to discard in the end. Again, for the plastics, you might need to check, for example, for pipette tip boxes. Some of them not sustainably recyclable. Some of them, for example, from Rhineland are. And so these are the options that you then have if you cannot change what you buy, but from whom you potentially buy it or how they delivered in the end. One last thing I want to mention here is alternative products. This is from the University of Pennsylvania, an amazing guide about solvents. That means if you, for example, work in a chemical lab, can you buy a different kind of solvent? Because if you go to the Dozen tool, which is, to my mind, created by some scientists in cooperation with Merck, based on the 12 principles, you can see how to make experiments more sustainable. And by optimizing your experiments and changing your solvents, you will not only reduce the footprint of the research itself, but also of your purchasing. Because obviously to produce ethanol is much more sustainable than when you think about carbon tetrachloride, benzene or chloroform, for example. And these are, of course, things that somehow tie the laboratory, your R&D processes very well together with your purchasing. And so for the very end, let me give you some potential solution, a little roadmap of what you might be able to go for. At first, awareness and assessment. I think this is quite obvious from what we have seen. You need to become aware of what sustainable procurement is, what articles are you actually buying, and of course, your prioritizations. That means you need to change your perspective to see what is more important to you. Is it necessary to buy a certain item, or can you change what you do? Is it more important for you to buy something with a reduced environmental impact in terms of delivery or in terms of end of life? Can you do something for the end of life? All of these things you need to decide within your company. And here the big question is, what is sustainability and what do you purchase? Learning and identification. This is not easy, but this is the part where you need to sit down, have a look at your processes, at what you're doing, and learn about the alternatives. And when you know about the alternatives, balancing risks and testing, you won't get around risks. Changing a process will always be related to risk. You don't know whether the new product will definitely work as well as the previous one. It is very probable if you, again, did your due diligence and read up on it. But again, if possible, test it at first. Don't change everything at once, but go step by step and see what is actually possible. Because again, also the reliability of your deliverer is important. If you set up an experiment and the reagents and chemicals do not come in time, you might have a much bigger problem than buying from somebody that has a little bit further way of delivery. Here again, the main question is which alternatives exist and which advantages do they offer? And finally, this is important for academia, but much more crucial for all companies: reporting, key performance indicators, and maintenance. Stay up to date and measure your impact. Even though it might not be important for you right now, regulations are coming. And if you then have a sense of what you're doing and what you can improve in the future, you will be much, much better off when then you have to report about all of these things. And this brings us to the end. These were 30 minutes. I hope this gave you a rather useful overview. Unfortunately, we could not cover everything, but in case you have any questions, you want to talk about anything, if I should go deeper into anything, we have no time. You can ask in the chat. Put in your questions, put in your remarks. Otherwise, you can always email us at education@readvance. Visit our website, and here we have a little QR code for our social media, because there we will post some of these more in-depth lessons that we could not dive into today. And of course, all of you, you'll receive the summary email about this event later on, where we will basically outline everything we've talked about, but also give you all the different kind of links and sources that you can read up on these topics yourself as well. Then I wish you a beautiful rest of your day and see you all around. Bye-bye.